All right, hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still somewhat on a staggered return, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin Rollercoaster Season 6, intriguing interviews with creative minds. Well, everyone here tonight are fans of science fiction, but the definition of science fiction varies, some leaning more heavily on science and others more on fiction. How does one play into the other? That's what we're going to find out tonight, thanks to our guest, ALAN SMALE. ALAN is an Oxford-trained astrophysicist who performs research into black holes and neutron stars at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Say that 3 times fast. He is also an award-winning author of alternate history, twisted history, and hard science fiction, and sings bass with his vocal band, The Chromatics. Welcome, ALAN.
Hello, thank you for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, good to see you. All right, just a quick heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for me or ALAN in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, as we always do, we'll start at the beginning. So ALAN, where were you born and where'd you grow up?
I was born in the north of England. I actually spent most of my young life in Yorkshire. My parents still live in the house where I did most of my growing up. And that's just outside Leeds, like 6 miles northwest of Leeds in Yorkshire. I was born on the other side of the Pennines. I was actually born in Cheshire, in Macclesfield, but I have very few memories of there. So I really consider myself like a Yorkshireman growing up.
Okay, so Leeds. So I actually went to university for a bit in Manchester, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump over there.
Right.
And I heard all the good footy songs. And if I can't even remember how the one song goes, but the end of it was "and Leeds." That's what I remember. My buddy was a big man. He was a big Man United fan.
Yes.
So talk to me about. So as a kid, was it just you and your parents? Did you have brothers, sisters?
I don't have any brothers or sisters. It was just me, but I had a lot of friends in the area, up the street, around the corner, and all of that. So I had a lot of other proxy families too. So yeah, it was just us.
Okay, so what were your parents like? What did they do?
My father worked for the local TV company, Yorkshire Television, and my mother was a homemaker. My mother stayed home. So my dad was on the technical side. I probably got some of my technical kind of background from him. He was definitely on the technical side at Yorkshire Television. When he retired, he was the director of technical operations, I believe, which is essentially everything that's not on the creative side.
So was he an engineer?
Yes, he was trained as an electrical engineer to begin with. He built his own TV when he was a teenager, I believe, like way back when.
Wow.
So,
okay.
A lot of technical skill there.
Can you do that too? Can you build a TV if you have?
I cannot. No, I don't have that much skill with electronics and that kind of thing. That was never really my passion. I have obviously have a strong physics background, but it doesn't stretch to that side of things. I did try soldering some boards together and that kind of thing when I was a kid, but I was never particularly good at that.
So what kept you busy? Like what was your, so you're a kid in so northwest England. What were you doing back then?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I was going to school. I was hanging out, going for drives on the Yorkshire moors with my parents. I did a fair amount of cycling, actually. I remember biking around both the Yorkshire Dales and the Lake District. I used to go and stay in youth hostels with a friend when I was a teenager. And we just used to bike around up some really, really steep hills and then down the other side of those really, really steep hills. And so that was a lot of fun. So yes, I did spend a fair amount of time. I've always liked traveling. And I think I started off doing a fair amount of traveling just in the local area, in the local shires around us.
So it was interesting. So for me anyway, so I did, the backpacking thing when I was at the end of my college career. This is pre-internet. So it was a kind of a different world. As an American, to travel overseas back then was kind of a big deal. It wasn't common like it is today. And I remember when I showed up after being on the road for, about a month, and I'd done, 10 countries, 20 cities, whatever it was, I can't remember. I was all sort of proud of myself because almost nobody that I knew back from the States had done this. Few people, but not a lot. But when I got to university and I was telling everyone these new friends that I made, and I thought they'd be all impressed, and they were like, yeah, so we all do this, right? This is it's just normal to because in the US, it's so huge geographically that, but you get in a car, you just go from New York to New Jersey to Pennsylvania. In Europe, you go the same distance, you're going into different countries, different cultures, different money, different backgrounds. So it's sort of an exciting thing. So when you were a kid, was it just that you kind of toured around England, or did you also go into, the rest of, let's say, mainland Europe?
Oh, yeah. No, the cycling and all of that I was talking about, that was when I was a teenager. Later on, when I was a student, I certainly went around Europe a lot. My first European trip was a backpacking trip with a friend of mine, and we were hitchhiking around, essentially relying on the goodwill of drivers and to drive us around the place. And we went through country after country after country, and did the same thing, went down through Europe and came up like the side and down through Scandinavia and went to all of the Scandinavian countries as well. And so we did that. I also did a couple of interrail holidays where you get one of these tickets that you can go anywhere on the European, anywhere on the European rail system. And filled in a lot of countries that I hadn't been to, and went to other places like Morocco and Turkey that were a little bit difficult to hitchhike around. So I really did cover the ground that way. And we felt really good about our travel as well until we met the Australians. And of course, we were doing it for a month or 6 weeks, and they would come over for 4 months. And they'd been to even more countries. They'd be talking in the youth hostel about all the places they'd been to. And we were like, well, I guess we're Europeans, we've done okay, but those guys, if they're going to come this far, they're really going to see everything.
Actually, it's funny that you say that. I was on one of the legs of my tour. I ended up in Salzburg, which was not a planned trip. I had all sorts of zigs and zags, and there was a whole group of Australians in the hostel. It had a big restaurant with a pub in it, and every other table, they're chatting and they're having some drinks. But of course, in the back, the Australians, they're like Americans, right? They're loud and they sing and they high five and they pound on the table and they come on, they really drag you all in, and they don't do anything by half measures. They're all in, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. So it's sort of common, at least in the folks that I met from England, that because of the interconnection of Europe, that either you're fluent or at least conversant in some other languages. Do you speak French, German, anything else?
I have some French. I learned French for 5 years when I was at school, and I learned Spanish for a while when I needed it as well. I'm actually not very good at speaking foreign languages. I have the vocabulary, but not really the accent. As you can tell, I've actually been in the States since I was in my late 20s, and I still have some trace of my English roots in my voice. And I actually find it very difficult to mimic other accents or come across with a really good accent. So I can learn all the vocabulary I like, but I'm still not really like fluent or impressive at other languages. When I was traveling, I traveled around with a guy whose father was a lecturer in German at Leeds University, and he was essentially fluent in German. My friend was essentially fluent in German as well. So with my crappy French and his really good German, we actually did pretty well.
You did okay. Yeah, all right.
Yes.
Yeah, at the time I was still working on my English, so I had to struggle. All right, so look, you're obviously a hardcore science and sci-fi kind of guy now, but was that always the case? Was that kind of your jam growing up, or did you come to that later?
I really enjoyed it when I was a kid as well. I remember one of the atlases, we had an atlas of the world at my house where I grew up. And in the frontispiece, like the inside front cover or something, was the solar system. And I always spent as much time just looking at those pages that showed the solar system and the 12 moons of Jupiter, because that's all we knew about at the time, and the 10 moons of Saturn or whatever it was. I was always really interested in astronomy, and we'll probably get to some of this later, but I was also extremely interested in the Apollo program when I was a kid, because a lot of the moon landings were going on. I do remember what was going on with the moon landings, and I was extremely into that as well. So I'd always been into space, and I'd always been into science, and I was interested in science generally because of my dad. And so, yeah, I've always had that background, and I've also always liked writing. I used to spend a lot of time writing. I guess now we'd call it fanfic. I would write like Star Trek stories and other things, and in addition to original stuff, even when I was really young. All
right, so you beat me to it a little bit, so I'll go there. So when I'm assuming, so your dad being an engineer, but does he and your mom, did did they actively encourage your, your passion for science and science fiction, or was it sort of like, well, all right, that's what he likes, so fine?
I'm not sure they encouraged the writing so much. They were always like keen to do whatever. Like my mother did type up some of my stories at one point. I guess they were encouraging in the way that parents are generally encouraging of just about anything creative a kid does. I think my dad was probably a little more into the science side. I don't really know actually, but so I think they were definitely supportive. They never tried to stop me from doing anything. They never said, put that writing down, leave that TV show alone, you should be
What
doing
about your
this.
friends? Did you have like a crew that was into the same things as you, or was that kind of like a solo mission?
Not really, no. I didn't really have a cadre of friends who were all into science when I was a kid. I don't remember that so much. I was an only child, as I mentioned, so a lot of that was solitary when I was doing that kind of looking into science and that writing. There were definitely things that I was just doing for me at that time.
Right. So you mentioned Star Trek. Were you watching Star Trek and Doctor Who and things like that?
Yep. Yes, I watched Star Trek and Doctor Who. I watched a lot of the classic British TV shows like Thunderbirds and UFO and Captain Scarlet, the Jerry Anderson series, which were also very science-based and very kind of science fiction-y. So yes, I watched a whole lot of that when I was a kid.
Was that so, going back, let's say, we are now living, let's say, in the age of the geek, right? The age of the nerd. But 20 years ago, that was not the case, especially 60s, 70s, 80s, you pick your slang, dork, weeb, loser, whatever. That's what you were then in the US anyway. Was that the same thing in the UK? Or no?
I don't think it was quite the same. I think there were a lot of people who are really into things like Thunderbirds and Doctor Who. I think it was much more acceptable. The schools that I was at anyway, that people would be interested in. Those TV shows were really popular across the board, I think. So I don't think they had really that stigma about them. I certainly never felt any of that.
Right. So talk to me. So, you had this innate curiosity, fascination, not just about science, but in particular about astronomy. I think a lot of kids, I went through it to some degree, but certainly not like you, looking at, the planets and the moons and the stars, and it's sort of, it sort of taps into sort of, I guess it sort of taps into that ethereal dreamer in us all, because it just, you can look at an atlas, everything is tangible. It's right here on the ground. If I have a car or you get in a plane, I could actually go. I might not go there, but I could. But you can't just say, well, you know what? I was thinking about taking a trip to Germany, but no, I think I'll go to Mars, right? You don't really have the option, right? So that's always sort of that, that there's a certain desire because it's unreachable. What sort of sucked you in to such a degree that it became your life?
Well, at the time, it wasn't obvious that it would be unreachable. I talked about the Apollo program, and that was going on in the early 70s. And things kind of lapsed a bit after that. But when I was a kid, I was convinced that space exploration would move more quickly than it has. Yeah. It's moved fast in many ways with the uncrewed probes, with the robotic probes, and astronomy has certainly made huge leaps and bounds. But I was actually assuming that the human spaceflight program would also take those leaps and bounds. And I actually, when I was a kid, I assumed that by the time I was the age I am now, that I would actually have the opportunity to get off the planet and maybe go into orbit or go to the moon or whatever it was. That seemed reasonable. I thought that was a reasonable ambition at that point. So it wasn't always completely out of the question as far as I was concerned. But even if I couldn't go, I was still interested. A friend of mine says that he remembers when I was age 13 that I told him I was going to work for NASA one day, and that was just like a kid joke at the time. Right. I don't actually remember saying that, but I think it's probably true considering the source. So I was obviously always keen on getting into that side of things, and if I couldn't get off the planet myself, I was certainly interested in astronomy, and that interest in astronomy sustained all the way through. My first degree was in physics, but I took all the astronomy courses that I could as well.
Do you think that I think about it intermittently, but I'm curious, especially for someone who this is your life, do you think that it was one of those moments where do you remember where you were when the space shuttle exploded, I was in school, we saw it on TV. Do you think that it seemed, my recollection of it is that at that moment, like there was so much hope about, wow, like this is where we're going, right? This is all right. They're going to do this. And then it's going to be more and more and more. And then it's sort of like it just shut down the idea of manned exploration. Like at that nanosecond, like our hopes, like our dreams of going into space seem to die right at that moment. Do you think that's kind of like is that an exaggeration, or you think that's sort of on the right track? I mean, this is your life. What do you think?
I think it is a bit of an exaggeration, because the shuttle program, speaking specifically about that did get itself back together again. There was obviously a lot of needed introspection. There was a lot of looking into what had gone wrong and trying to figure out how to never have something like that go wrong again. And that was all very necessary, I think. But I think it didn't really, some things changed in the shuttle program, but we still had a very successful shuttle program altogether. We had like hundreds of flights and assembled the space station and all of those kinds of things. And so a lot of what we were trying to do with the space shuttle, we actually ended up achieving a lot of it. The space shuttles didn't do as much science in space as we were expecting. A lot of the pure science payloads were, they decided to do fewer of those and more of the more engineering things with the shuttle. But I don't think that really held us back a lot. Spaceflight is always going to be dangerous. We had the Apollo 13 near disaster with Apollo 13, and there were people who died on the ground, both in the US and Soviet space programs, and a Soviet guy who burned up coming back through the atmosphere. And so these things that were not easy to do, and there's a risk involved, and sometimes, unfortunately, disasters can happen.
So maybe let me rephrase a little bit. So on the practical side, right, the actual space program kept going, but it feels like sort of emotionally, from psychologically, emotionally, on a broader scale. I mean, I can speak from the American point of view anyway, that after that happened, the idea that we could just say, all right, let's just look, it was a big loss. We took a loss, let's shake it off and let's go back. I remember kind of the sense of it being that, like, it was almost like the collective consciousness about what it could be seemed to kind of die that day. Not the program itself, because it kept going, but as a people, we didn't seem to talk about it the way we did before that happened.
Yeah, that could be, yes.
So, okay. So let me ask you this. So you got into, you followed, you went to university. Where'd you go to university? Where'd you study?
I went to Oxford. I went to Oxford University, St Edmund Hall. And I took my first degree there was in physics. So I did a lot of general physics, and I also took astronomy options in the first and third year when they were offered to me. And then I went on to do a PhD there, a doctorate there.
Is that where that was in astronomy?
Yeah, the doctorate, it's called a DPhil there rather than a PhD at Oxford. But yes, it's a doctorate, and I took that in the astrophysics division at Oxford University. So
at that point, was your thought like, all right, it's basically like NASA or bust?
Not necessarily. I did look into other alternatives as well. My first postdoctoral position was at the Millard Space Science Laboratory of University College London. And at that point, I was very much doing pure science. I was doing optical astronomy with optical observatories in various places, South Africa and Australia and Chile. And I was also doing X-ray astronomy, like observing X-rays from bright objects in the sky using a European satellite called Exosat. So I was very much on the astronomy track at that particular point. Hang on. Yeah.
So
okay.
This is your world. So as I was going to say here in one of my next questions, for those of us who maybe skipped out on our AP astronomy class, let's go back just a little bit. So you said you're doing X-ray astronomy, but you said one thing before that.
I said I was talking about optical astronomy from ground-based observatories.
So what is that?
You have a telescope inside a dome. You've probably seen them on TV, and so we're observing various sources. I do galactic astronomy, so I'm looking at very powerful sources in our own galaxy. There's a class of objects called X-ray binaries, which emit very strongly at X-rays. So in addition to sending normal light towards the Earth, they're sending X-ray emission towards the Earth as well.
So no, are those stars?
They're actually binary star systems where you have a neutron star or a black hole in a very close binary with a normal star. And so the normal star is actually donating matter into the compact object, the neutron star, which is extremely compressed neutron system, or a black hole. And so that's where the X-rays come from.
Okay, all right. Okay, again, so I'm going to slow you down just a little bit. Again, for us non-sciencey people. Okay, so
yeah.
A neutron star is?
A neutron star is an extremely dense object. A neutron star, when you have a normal atom, you have the nucleus and you have electrons around them. So an atom, if you think of an atom as being fairly large in that sense, a neutron star is constructed just of the part in the middle, the nuclei of that atom. Mm-hmm. So it's a whole bunch of nuclei, essentially. So what it means is that if you have a star like the sun and really compressed it down and down and down until it was only 10 kilometers across, about 7 miles across, right. And you had all the mass and all the matter of the sun in something that small, that would be a neutron. That's essentially what a neutron star is.
How does that, so if you have, let's say a regular star like the sun, mm-hmm. how does a neutron star, how does it become a neutron star? How does that actually happen?
Through a supernova. What happens is, like a large star will blow off its outer layers, and what remains will collapse in on itself. The gravity will take over, and it'll just collapse right in on itself and create these extremely dense objects, these neutron stars. And if the supernova is big enough, it collapses so far that it becomes a black hole, which is a different thing entirely.
Okay, so hold on, I want to go back to just a second. So this star, so in essence, if I'm hearing you right, it sheds its outer shell.
Yes.
Right.
Blows it up off.
So and that radiation just travels throughout the galaxy, right? Is that what happens to it?
The shell grows and grows and grows.
And then internally, let's call it the core, kind of goes, it kind of compresses in on itself. And then, so that's the neutron star. Yes?
Yes.
And then if that explosion was ginormous to the nth degree, it could potentially become so dense, it becomes a black hole.
Correct, yes, that's exactly right.
So what a black hole sort of, we have this vague sense of what a black hole is, but what is it actually, this black hole? Is it actually a hole, or does it just look like a hole?
It's sort of an abstraction in a way. It does actually look like a hole. It's a singularity in space-time. And now you're going to ask me what that is. And the real truth of it is that it's a very complicated concept. Essentially, this is so massive that it's fallen in on itself. And so there's something called the event horizon, which you may have heard of. And beyond the event horizon, once you get beyond that, no light or no matter can escape from the black hole. And so we actually have very little information about what happens beyond the event horizon of a black hole, except to know that they can be extremely heavy, essentially very dense objects. And they do look like holes in space. They don't emit matter. You can see them because of the X-rays of material approaching a black hole, but you can't actually see the hole itself.
So again, this is sort of going back to, what very little I know of astronomy at that level. So when that star explodes, why does a star explode to the point where it kind of sheds that outer shell? Like what causes that explosion?
This is actually not my field to a huge degree, but it's some supernova. There's also several different types of supernovae, and they have different types of causes.
Okay.
So,
all right, fair. All right,
type 1 and type 2.
All right, so we'll just make sure that your bosses don't see this part of the interview.
That's okay. I don't have to be an expert at everything because nobody is.
Just kidding. Like, what's a black hole? Like, well, I'm not really sure, but it's a big spot in space, so I guess that's good enough. I'm just messing with you. All right, so this is something I really wanted to ask. So your job literally is to study the universe, or at least components of it, and you've spent decades doing this. So having done it so intensely, you've studied it through telescopes, I'm sure you're studying. So let me ask you this. So day to day, you at one point you were literally looking through telescopes and you were kind of seeing what's out there. So what is it that you're doing now? What kind of experiments do you actually do? Like, what are you studying now? Or what kind of stuff do you study?
I actually do less science now than I used to. I do more management. A lot of people end up moving into management as they get more senior, and so that is something that I'm doing at the moment. Doing a fair amount of science management and enabling science, making sure other people have what they need to do science. For most of my career, I was actually studying these types of objects, the neutron star binaries, the black hole binaries in our galaxy, and also recently, we've discovered a lot of planets around other stars, and I was starting to get interested in those as well. That was something that I always was interested in as a kid, the idea of planets around other stars and life in other star systems.
So you say you study it, but how do you, like, what do you do? How do you actually, what do you study? What are you actually observing?
You make observations of stars. You look at these kinds of objects. You see how their brightness varies with time. You look at the spectra from them and try and derive the physics from underneath. You can tell a lot about like temperatures and magnetic fields and gravitational fields by studying the light curves and spectra, like the variability and the spectra of these objects. And that's really what I used to do. And I still do a bit of that. I still work with some students. I'm not analyzing the data so much anymore, but they certainly are.
All right, so given that that's what you did, you're literally studying information that's coming from space.
Yep.
What can you share with us from your perspective? What have you learned or perceived about the nature of the cosmos? Like, what have you come to any conclusions about anything?
I wouldn't say that I myself was responsible for any deep truths about the universe. I've certainly published a whole bunch of papers on different types of these sources, seeing like what the masses are of particular objects in particular binaries, figuring out what range of characteristics some of these objects have, and that kind of thing. Understanding of the universe. We have recently, although I didn't make these discoveries, we've certainly made discoveries of things like gravitational waves and things that we postulated should exist, but hadn't actually observed until very recently. And we're learning a lot more about how matter really behaves under very high magnetic fields and very high gravitational fields.
I mean, just given the fact that, you know, what you're studying and how long it takes light and energy to travel from one point to another, I mean, what does that got to tell you about, what does that tell us, or even theoretically about the scope and the size of what's really out there?
Well, certainly the universe is vast, and we know that we can look back 13.7 billion years into the farthest reaches of the universe. And we've just launched the James Webb Space Telescope, which will enable us to look even closer to the Big Bang in the infrared area. So we know that space is huge, space is full of galaxies and clusters of galaxies.
All right,
and each
folks,
of those galaxies has a billion stars.
Newsflash, space is really big.
There you are.
See, there you go. All right, you see, and I didn't even have to get my PhD in astronomy to learn that.
There you go.
All right, so I want to ask this. So given that, so we're also in the world of science fiction, that science fiction in all of its forms, it's still fiction, even on a hypothetical basis. What does sci-fi get correct about astrophysics, and what does it absolutely get wrong?
That depends on the writer. There are a lot of really good hard science fiction writers who spend a lot of time studying this kind of thing, and they try and make their work as accurate as possible. People like Gregory Benford and David Brin and John Henry, also known as Jack Campbell. A lot of people actually spend the time, they do get the astrophysics right by and large. And when they have ships moving through space or whatever it may be, you can rely on the fact that they actually are obeying like the laws of physics. They're by and large, a number of writers will write within what we know about physics. They don't exceed the speed of light. They use regular physics, and they use it very well and may have it play into their stories. There are other people, of course, who don't do so much. And for them, it's more of a game. For them, it's okay, unless this is fine too. It's okay to have faster than light travel in your story. It's okay to break some of the laws of physics if you want to, as long as it's clear what you're doing. So I think it really depends from writer to writer how carefully they take the physics and how much they go into it. It's a spectrum, right? A lot of things are a spectrum. You've got the really hard science fiction writers on one end, and the softer science fiction writers, the more kind of space opera type Yeah, and those space operas, a lot of space operas are kind of huge, large scale, very entertaining, but they're not necessarily being rigorous about the laws of physics. And that doesn't matter because their job is to tell a good story. So there's all kinds of things in science fiction.
So if you could impose just one unbreakable rule about the science and science fiction, what would it be?
I don't think I would, actually. I think it's much more interesting to let people's imaginations go where they like. And you often hear writers say to each other, you know, you're allowed one impossible thing in your book. You may be allowed faster than light travel, but everything else you have to play fair with. Or maybe you're allowed telepathy, but everything else has to be. So you're allowed one kind of quasi-magical thing in your story. Otherwise, you start like pressing people's patience and stretching the bounds of what they're willing to accept. So you have to be a little constrained, but I don't think there's any individual thing that I wouldn't want people to do.
Okay. Quick interlude for folks who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments for Alan or me, send them in the chat box, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right. So I wanted to ask this. So being an astrophysicist from the UK who's into music, so Brian May from Queen is also an astrophysicist. Have you ever met them? Did you ever meet?
I have never met Brian May. I really wish I had. I was a big Queen fan growing up as well, in addition to being into the space program and all that. I was very much into Queen. I knew that he had an astronomy background, and he went back to it afterwards. He got his PhD from one of the London universities fairly late on in life, like after he'd finished touring with Queen. And so he is now Dr. Brian May. And I do know people who have met him, but I have not met him myself.
So just a quick, I happened to hear the story from a friend of mine, and apparently, as the story goes, that Brian May was this brilliant scientist and he was going to become an astrophysicist, but then music became his life, and his dad was really upset that he had done this. How could you abandon this career as a brilliant scientist to go play your silly little music? And they had a real problem for a long time. But after he became famous, they played a gig at the Garden in New York, and he brought his parents in to see him play. And after they played, apparently his dad said, "I get it. Wow, well done." And it was like it was a very big. So I'm told. So a very nice moment. And then he went on to become an astrophysicist anyway. So
glad he got some parental approval.
There you go. All right, so let me shift over. So we're talking about your background. We talked about a lot of stuff. So when did you said you first started writing a little bit, when you were younger, but when did you kind of first sort of get serious about the fiction?
I really started writing for publication when I was about 30 years old, after I'd done my PhD, after I'd got done my postdoc, because I spent a lot of time. I essentially spent all my time either traveling or studying at that point. Very little time for writing. So I'd moved to the States in my late 20s, and it was really like in my early 30s that I started writing seriously, writing short fiction and trying to sell it to magazines and that kind of thing. So, and since then I've had about 50 stories published in short fiction stories published in magazines, including Asimov's and Realms of Fantasy and those kinds of magazines. So I'm pretty happy with that. But yeah, so it really took into my 30s when I really started getting serious about the writing.
So do you think that because of your background, your training, your studies, I'm just sort of speculating, but tell me if you think I'm right or wrong, that many science fiction writers, including myself, not all, but many, we're not astrophysicists. We're not necessarily, astronomy specialists. I'm assuming that because you have such a hardcore understanding and knowledge of the mechanics of space, that it just imbues you with a certain confidence to sort of, that you almost don't have to sort of spend as much time kind of figuring out the mechanics of how things work, because you already know how they work, and you can focus more on the story and just sort of instinctively fold in the science into your fiction. Is that accurate, not accurate?
It's accurate for the book that I've just finished, for the book that's coming out in June, because that one is a very kind of hard science fiction based book. A lot of the writing I do is actually alternate history and historical fiction and historical fantasy, which is kind of a different thing. So I do a fair amount of studying for those stories to get really into the background of what I need to know to write about Romans or Native Americans or the gunpowder plot or whatever it might be. I think the confidence you're talking about does help me there. The confidence of knowing that I can go and do research and I can read complicated papers and drag information out of them. That helps me when I'm reading like archaeological literature or something like that. I don't feel intimidated by the words I don't know or the background that I don't have. So I think it's helpful from that point of view. But so for the hard science fiction, certainly I still have to keep doing a fair amount of research to make sure I get all the details right. But yeah, you're right, for the hard science fiction, I do have a lot of the background already.
So sticking on the theme of alternate history. So alternate history is, so hard science fiction is its own sort of creature. Alternate fiction, alternate history is its own kind of creature. They're very different in many regards, unless you're doing alternate sci-fi history. What draws you to reinterpret or reimagine history?
I've always been a history buff. It was never something that I particularly concentrated on at school because I was always doing the more scientific and technical things. But I grew up in England. There's a lot of history in England. There's a lot of Tudor homes. There's a lot of Roman ruins. And when I was younger, I did go and tour around a lot of those. So I did get an interest in history from a very early age. And it just seemed that as I was writing more, I did some fantasy and some horror and some hard science fiction, but I seem to be getting drawn more and more to the alternate history side. And part of it was that it was different from my day job. Part of it actually is that I don't want to think about science in my spare time as well as during my day job. So writing alternate history was actually something that was very different for me. It was something that was different from the day job, something that I could relax while I was doing, switch my mind to something else. And I got genuinely interested in how history could have been different and how, there's a whole bunch of historical events. The more you read about them, the more you realize that they were contingent on some chance here or there, like what one person was thinking, what the weather was like that day, whether somebody managed to get to a specific place in time for a certain event. And I got to realizing and understanding, like a lot of other people have understood, that things could be very different. If very small things had changed in history, we could actually be living in a fairly different world now. And so I got really into that idea and really keen on exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, sort of, there's a story about, I think it was Valkyrie, how close Hitler came to actually being killed long before he died, right? It was a matter of feet. Right, it was the difference. I mean, one story that doesn't get told often. I'm physically in New Jersey, but I grew up in New York. I've been in New York my whole life, and when the Trade Center came down in 2001, that wasn't the first attack on the building. The first one happened about 10, 15 years before that. And what most people don't realize is that what had happened is that the terrorists drove a van into the parking garage at the base of the building. And they planted a bomb, they left, and the bomb went off. It worked, except for one thing. The guy parked the van in the wrong spot. He literally was supposed to park it right next to a support beam. And if that beam had gone out, the building would have come down. It was that structural moment, but he literally parked it on the other side of the garage. So it just kind of made a mess, and that was it. Had he literally parked the van in that one spot, in the right spot, it would have come down before that. And God knows what that would have done, because we would have been living in a different time, and our ability to recalibrate would have been different, and who knows? And God knows how many times things like that have happened, the sort of, so close, but so far.
Yeah.
Do you have, when you write alternate history, is your approach more, if just this one little thing had been different, the butterfly effect, right? If this one little thing happened, we go all the way this way? Or is it more like, well, this is kind of how these events happen, but I kind of want to say, well, what if we reimagined it and it looked kind of completely different? Or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two, and I've done it both ways, really. I had a story that came out last year. This was a short fiction piece in Tales from Alternate Earths, Volume 3, and that was about the gunpowder plot. November the 5th, the Houses of Parliament, there was gunpowder. This actually is somewhat similar to your previous anecdote, your story. And in that case, in our real history, the gunpowder plot was averted. We discovered Guy Fawkes. They discovered Guy Fawkes under the Houses of Parliament.
Right.
All that gunpowder didn't go off. Parliament wasn't blown up. The king wasn't blown up, etc. But I actually, in the story in this book, I was imagining what would have happened if that plot had succeeded, and if the gunpowder plot had been successful in killing the king and most of Parliament. And so there, when people are talking about alternate history, they talk about the point of departure, which is when things change. And so in that story and several others of my stories, I actually look at points of departure and imagine what would have happened in the immediate aftermath if things had been different. Then again, with my Clash of Eagles series, for example, my series of books from Del Rey, I'm imagining a world where something happened 1,000 years previously. Essentially, the Roman Empire, the evolution of the Roman Empire took place in a different way, and the Roman Empire did not fall in the 4th, 5th centuries. So the classical Roman Empire survived in that classical form and didn't mutate as it did in our world. And I'm looking at the consequences of that. But the story isn't about that. The story is actually about the Romans now moving into North America in the 13th century. They're helped by the Norse, who have already discovered North America. And so the story actually takes place 1,000 years after the point of departure in a very different world. And so that's what those books are really about. So I think I've taken both approaches.
All right, that's great. But now it's time for a special segment on the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get, and the categories are Attack of the Clones, Quantum Leap, Dreamweaver, Music Lover, Close Encounters, Strangers in a Strange Land, and Kick 'em in the Junk. All right, you ready?
I have absolutely no idea what's going on, but sure.
All right. And, all right, Music Lover. Again, it's a popular one. Seems to come up a lot. Okay, so what song or piece of music do you love no matter how many times you hear it?
Okay, which Rush song do I choose for this?
Another Rush head, okay.
I don't know. I've been a fan of Rush all my life as well as Queen. Actually, I can listen to pretty much anything by those two bands at any time of day or night. Yeah, tough question. It's tough to pick one song or one album. I think it's hard.
Oh, that's the question. What's the answer?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess 2112 by Rush.
2112. Okay. All right. Have a lot of Rush. A lot of Rush fans seem to come on the show. I'm a Rush fan. Rush fans.
Smart people, of course.
Yes, there you go. Yes. All right. So next up, we've got a new section on the show where we're going to pick your poison. All right, and you can choose A, B, or C.
Okay.
Pick A. Just pick one.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to show me 3 options.
Nope.
B.
B. All right.
I'm choosing B.
And B is all right. This is the newest segment on the show. All right. So this is all or nothing or steady as she goes. So bear with me. There's a little bit of a setup on this one. So just give me a second. All right. So I'm going to give you 2 options that will define the rest of your writing career. And you can only pick one of the options. And here are the options. Okay. Now, option 1, your next book is an international bestseller. You win every award there is. You make tons of money. Your book gets made into an Academy Award, into a movie that wins Academy Award for Best Picture. You can ride this success forever. You will always be that guy. However, every book you write after that, I'm talking every single one, is an absolute dumpster fire. Critically trashed and a commercial 0. You are called a washed up hack for the rest of your life who can no longer even string 2 cohesive sentences together. Or you can keep writing as you are now. You are generally well respected, and whatever income you've generated thus far from your writing career will be about as good as it ever gets. So given these 2 choices for the rest of your writing career, all or nothing, or steady as she goes?
Steady as she goes. I would continue. I would like to have a longer career and have a bunch of stories, a bunch of books that were respected and not just one that people would probably consider was a fluke if there was only one of them.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes. We're going to take some questions from the audience. So let's see what we got here for you. All right, so one here's just a comment, not really a question. Really enjoyed Clash of Eagles. So there's one for you.
Great, thank you.
All right, so is Henderson's relish better than Lee and Perrin's?
I have never had Henderson's relish, so I'm going to say that Lee and Perrin's must be better.
Okay, there you go. Okay, all right. See what do we got? What do we got here? All right, how much should we be able to find out about exoplanet atmospheres with the Webb telescope?
Actually, quite a lot, because the James Webb Space Telescope has a lot of capability in the infrared, and it's above the Earth's atmosphere. It's obviously quite a long way away from the Earth. And so we'll be able to make measurements that we've never before been able to make. And certainly the James Webb Space Telescope has a lot of, and can make a lot of precision measurements. It can make a lot of very sensitive measurements. So yeah, we might find out quite a bit about exoplanet atmospheres, about the atmospheres of exoplanets, planets around stars that are fairly close to us, like up to a few dozen light years. So we might well be able to find out what's growing in those atmospheres, if there's vegetation, if there's technical capabilities that we can detect in spectra. So actually the Webb telescope will be able to tell us a lot about exoplanet atmospheres.
Exoplanet, just for those who don't know.
Those are just planets around other stars. It's like solar systems, but around with other suns, with different suns. And one thing we've learned over the last few years is that there are planets around basically all. You can assume that there's planets on average around all the stars you can see in the sky, and that's not a bad approximation, really. So from the numbers and the statistics we have, we're very confident that our galaxy is full of exoplanets. It's full of planets around other stars.
So I'm going to just follow up on this one. So, I mean, it's probably a question that we constantly think about. It's been asked a million times. Based on everything that we know right now, how likely is it that there are other planets that could be another Earth or could sustain, a high life forms and not just sort of microbes or light vegetation? I mean, what do you think the odds are of that being real?
I think the odds are very high, and I think a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about this, and people are studying it a great deal and putting together numbers and hypotheses. I think it's extremely unlikely that our Earth is the only one that has ever come to form intelligent life. One of the questions is when that life would take place, because if life evolved on an exoplanet around another star, but it all happened 1 million years ago and then they all died out, then we wouldn't be able to find out about them now necessarily. So you have to not only have intelligent life, but they have to be around right now so that we can detect evidence for them, perhaps. So personally, I think the odds are extremely high. There must be intelligent life elsewhere in the universe.
All right, so another question. Dark matter, best guess as to what it really is and what you think it isn't.
I have no idea what dark matter is, and most astronomers don't either. There are various hypotheses about what it could be, and these actually run the gamut. They're running across the field from particles that we haven't yet been able to identify or discover, all the way through to like fairly large, large brown dwarfs, or small planet-sized things, but a very large number of them that we're not aware of. And we don't know what dark matter is, and I certainly don't.
Okay. All right. So follow-up question. I have a follow-up question. So again, if we're positing that, all right, let's just assume for the sake of argument, somewhere in the universe, there's life out there at least as intelligent as we are, hopefully more so. What do you think, based on where we are now, as from a technological standpoint, and given what computers are doing, what AI may or may not do, what do you think is a reasonable supposition about how long it will take until we can create vehicles and fuel sources that will allow us to travel outside our galaxy?
Outside our galaxy? Outside our solar system would be much easier.
Either or both.
Yeah, the galaxy is pretty large, so let's stick to outside our solar system.
Yeah.
We actually have the technology to do that now, but it will be a very slow journey. It will take us a long time to get to Alpha Centauri or any of the nearest stars. Right. Technically, we could do it now, but it would be really expensive as well to to put any to put a large ship together that could go there with a reasonably large number of people. So the technology, I think, is not the difficult part. The difficult part is the will and the money to go and do it.
Let me ask you that. This is sort of, again, not understanding the mechanics of the universe like you do. So let's say, we have the ability. Let's just say we had the will and we said, all right, we're going to do this, right? We've got the money. We're gonna find the money and we're gonna do it. Are there forces throughout, the solar system, whether it's radiation or other elements in that just occur that would, destroy a ship on its own, that it just wouldn't be able to survive?
Certainly we'd have to worry about radiation, because the sun emits a lot of radiation, particularly when there are solar flares and that kind of thing. And there's a large amount of radiation in space for various reasons. So you would have to make sure that you were shielded against that and that all your people on board didn't get radiation sickness and die. There's also the risk of large chunks of rock flying through space, right. The comets, the meteors, the asteroids. So you have to, those would be possible dangers as well as you make your way out of the solar system.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to share my screen, and because I know Alan's got some stuff to show us, and then we'll go from there. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. So we are going to bump and share. Okay. So Alan, what are we looking at here?
Look at that, it's my next book. Okay, so my previous books I told you about were the Clash of Eagles series. And so there's 3 books in that series: Clash of Eagles, Eagle in Exile, and Eagle and Empire. And they came out from Del Rey in 2015 through 2017. And so that was the Roman Empire moving into North America. This is very different. This is Hot Moon, which is my alternate Apollo thriller that's set entirely on and around the moon. And it's set in 1979, so it's much more contemporary. It's in a timeline where the Apollo program keeps going. You can see where the roots for this came from in my childhood. Because I really wanted the Apollo program to keep going after Apollo 17. In this book, I get my wish. So now we're on the moon. Both the Americans and the Soviets have bases on the moons. The American base is on Hadley Plain, where Apollo 15 landed, and the Soviets have their own moon base as well by Copernicus crater. And the Cold War is still ongoing. As you can probably tell from the cover here, there's going to be some pretty exciting lunar action that takes place. So yes, essentially on and around the moon, my heroine Vivian Carter, who you can see on the steps of this lunar module, she's the first female commander of an Apollo mission, and she'll end up being the 3rd woman on the moon. And as they say, hijinks will ensue. There's a lot of action, a lot of adventure. I am a science guy, so there's a lot of really hard science in this as well. I tried to make this as realistic as possible to what was going on in the Apollo program, and a reasonable extrapolation to where we could have been in just a few years afterwards if the Apollo program had kept going. And this is coming out from K6 Science Fiction and Fantasy. That's an imprint of Arc Manor Books, and it'll be coming out in June of this year, June of 2022. I believe it's June the 14th. It's already available for pre-order on Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com and all good places where books are sold.
All right.
So, Hot Moon coming up.
All right, sounds great. So for anyone who's watching, make sure you pick this up. It's going to be a good one, I'm sure. All right, so thanks, Alan. As for me, sticking with the sci-fi theme, I'll encourage you to check out my sci-fi noir series featuring hard-boiled intergalactic private eye Angela Hardwick, part Doctor Who, part Blade Runner, and part Philip Marlowe, in both Fractured, Crackle and Fire and, Fractured Lives. Hardwick and her young protege, Eric Whistler, walk the streets of eternity, the galactic realm that oversees the design, construction, and maintenance of the universe. That the cases take them on realm and off, not only challenging their ideas about how deep the corruption can go, but the very nature of the relationship between mentor and mentee. In Crackle and Fire, they are hired by an accountant who gets mixed up with dueling gangsters and a madman with galactic ambitions of his own. And in Fractured Lives, they are hired to find out if a college freshman, who is also a galaxy design savant, is suffering from a nervous breakdown or is the victim of an urban legend known as the Scarlet Raj. Crackle and Fire and Fractured Lives are available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And book 3 in the series will be out in September. All right, Alan, I want to thank you so much for for coming on to the show tonight. And I want to thank everyone who's watching at home. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro. And as always, I will see you next week. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks, guys. This is great. See you.